All right.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's Hillcrest Zoom seminar. My name is Dave Erickson. I'm the principal at Hillcrest. Well, if you're in the Calgary area, or I think even most of Alberta, you will have woken up to a fresh layer of fluffy snow this morning. Just to remind us that we are now midway through November. We're going to get through this, folks. The year is almost over, so hang in there. On September 29th, which seems like a long time ago, we had a Hillcrest Zoom on harassment liability for employers in the #MeToo era. And our guest speaker for that event was Janelle Butler from Brownlee Law, and she did a great job of unpacking this ongoing issue. After that presentation, we got a lot of feedback from the people who were on the call, really positive feedback, but wanting us to do a follow-up, kind of a part two, which we've been affectionately calling #MeToo Part 2, but more from a human resource perspective with case studies and learnings from real life examples, sort of a what happened, how it was handled, what could have been done better, and what was done right. So to do this, we decided to go back to Jane Helbrecht from Acuity HR Solutions in Winnipeg. And Jane is with us today, as well as her colleague, Devan Graham, also from Acuity HR. Now, I know, and I'm well aware of the fact that the last couple of Hillcrest Zooms have gone way over time. So we're gonna try to hold it to an hour today. And a big part of that is I'm gonna talk less. So I'm keeping my comments just as brief as possible. You can read Jane and Devan's biographies in the invitation that you received. Just a reminder that this is being recorded, and probably works if you have like an immediate question that you just need to ask. You can jump in and ask it, but probably works better to use the chat function that's just at the bottom of your screen to put questions in, and Jane and Devan will be looking for that. So Jane, Devan, thank you so much for joining us from Winnipeg today. Over to you.
Great. Okay, so thank you so much for having us. Dave and Jillian from Hillcrest, thank you. So we're going to be sharing a little bit today about sort of what comes next. We're going to share a couple of case studies with you, and then what happens after we've had an incident or an investigation or something has happened in our organization. And so this is sort of what can organizations do and what can leaders do following an investigation to ensure that those involved feel safe and supported in the Me Too era. Devan, I'll have you move to the next slide here. You can see my and Devan's bios here quickly. As Dave mentioned, you can take a look at those in the invite. As mentioned, we're both from Acuity HR here in Winnipeg, which focuses on HR consulting and also with a really big focus on employee engagement and leadership development as well. So I'm going to share one case, and then Devan's going to share the other case. And then we're going to go into talking about getting back to work. So how do we do that safely following an investigation or an incident? How do we consider performance and business continuity to make sure that things continue to keep running following an incident? And then how do we restore relationships, and how do we sort of gauge workplace culture to move forward? So the first case example that I want to share with you is what we're calling the two-handed handshake. So this is a situation that a colleague of ours was involved in a few years ago with an organization. And in this situation, I'll give you sort of the rundown of the situation. I'll share a little bit about the context, and then we'll share with you some of the mistakes and some of the things that were learned through this process. Now, unfortunately, this particular group didn't involve us in helping resolve the problem earlier, which led to a few mistakes, a few things they learned the hard way through this process. In this particular scenario, we had a female complainant who made a complaint about her male colleague. And the basis of the complaint was that the male colleague had given her a handshake, and it was a two-handed handshake. So was shaking her hand and sort of put the other hand on top, maybe a slightly longer handshake, not super uncomfortably long, but maybe an extra beat or two over what you might consider a normal length of a handshake. Some of the context here is that the male colleague in this case, he had a large caseload in terms of the work he was working on, a lot of projects, and some of his projects had been transitioned to his female colleague so that she could help in terms of capacity. And so he was shaking her hand to thank her for taking this work on for him. So on the surface of it, to many of us, we might look at this situation and go, okay, this doesn't exactly sound like a reason to complain, but the complainant did make a complaint and alleged sexual harassment, alleged unwanted touching. And in this particular scenario, there's some important context that goes into it. One of the pieces of context is that the respondent, the male in this case, is an imposing figure. He was about 7 feet tall. He had an imposing presence, which may have impacted the sort of perception of the situation as well. Another piece of the puzzle here was that the complainant came from a trauma-informed lens, or what we would call a trauma-informed lens, which means this is somebody who had some very negative experiences in their past, had some significant trauma in their past, and may have impacted how this person sort of perceived or felt in terms of safety in this situation. And that was very real to the female complainant in this scenario. So that gives you a little bit of context. One thing that's also important to note here is that the organization, when the complaint was made, they immediately suspended the male respondent. They suspended him from work without pay. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on and talk about some things they might have done a little bit differently there. One other piece of context I want to add, just in terms of the layers of this situation, is that about a week prior to the handshake, the respondent, the male in the situation, had been talking to his colleagues. He was talking about how he wanted to do a performance. He was somebody who likes to perform. He was thinking about putting himself out there and doing this performance sort of out of work, and was asking if his colleagues would come and see him perform. And the female colleague, the complainant in this case, said, oh, you know, she doesn't know if she would come because the last time she went to that type of event or performance, the performer actually made fun of her. Sort of pointed her out, made fun of how she looked, something like that. She said, so I don't know if I would want to go to that type of event. And in this case, the male colleague said, oh, well, you know, obviously I would never make fun of you. And, you know, you're a very attractive woman, so I would never make fun of you for how you look. That's one little piece of context there as well. A week prior had said that, and then there was this handshake a week later. So moving on to the next piece here, want to think a little bit about intent. And does intent matter? Now, one of the challenges in this case was that the organization, when looking at this complaint, they didn't really consider all of the context of this situation. And they didn't really consider two things, which is, you know, the impact that it had, the intent and the impact, and also sort of the reasonableness of what a normal person might do or feel in this situation. And so what we've seen over the past number of years is that there's less of a focus on intent and more of a focus on impact. So in the past, where we might have looked at it and said, well, the person didn't intend to make the person uncomfortable. You know, the person didn't intend to harass. It was just a joke. They intended a joke, right? Or something like that. We're now saying intent doesn't matter as much. The impact is what matters. And there was an impact in this situation. Now, we're still going to try and understand where both the complainant and the respondent are coming from. And ultimately, what we're going to consider is, would the respondent, the male colleague in this case, have reasonably known that his behavior might have made his female colleague uncomfortable? And the female colleague, again, in a sort of a reasonable test, would somebody, you know, most people in that situation reasonably be impacted or made to feel uncomfortable by that handshake. So we're applying sort of a reasonable test. And you'll see that in a lot of policies, there's a shift from focusing on intent to impact, and also sort of the mention of that idea of, would the person have reasonably have known? So that's a shift that we're seeing. And there is some important cultural context here too. So once you know, we got to dig into this situation a little bit more, it turned out that the male respondent was somebody who was newer to Canada. And in his culture, in particular, it was very common to do the two-handed handshake as a form and sign of deep respect. In his mind, he was specifically making an effort to say, thank you, I appreciate this, I respect you for taking this on. It was really meant to be a sign of respect. He had no idea that this wasn't a common practice in Canada. He had no idea that it might have seemed a little bit odd to the complainant in this particular case. And so when we looked at him and understood the context and actually did a little bit of research from a cultural perspective as well, we came to know that from his perspective, from a reasonableness perspective, he did not reasonably know that this could have made his female colleague uncomfortable. And so Devan, if you want to move to the next slide here, we can talk a little bit about some of the learnings here. Now, number one is they suspended the male respondent before the investigation had been completed, and they suspended him without pay. That was sort of mistake number one that they made. Whenever we're in a situation where we're going to do any sort of investigation, a complaint has been made, it has not been proven to be true at this point, it's alleged. We can send people home, and in many cases we may need to send people home if we can't separate them during the course of an investigation, but we always send somebody home with pay. We don't call it a suspension because the person is not being punished for anything, because we have not yet completed our investigation and we do not have findings that we can share. So this person would have been sent home with pay until the investigation was complete, at which point you could then make a decision about what next steps are. So that's number one. Number two is that context piece. This organization did approach this situation on their own as though it was absolutely a case of sexual harassment. They actually proceeded to suspend the male respondent a second time after the investigation was complete and they found it as sexual harassment. And so they suspended him a second time without pay. But one of the mistakes they really made here is they didn't consider the context of the situation. So they didn't consider that cultural context of the male respondent and where he was coming from. They also didn't consider the context of the complainant, and that when looking at that reasonable test, many people would not have felt the same discomfort that she felt in that situation. That her threshold for what was appropriate or inappropriate or uncomfortable was a little bit lower based on her past history. Now, that doesn't mean that her feelings aren't completely valid and need to be addressed in a way that makes her feel safe and that her concerns are valid, but it might impact the findings and some of the resolution. Again, sort of adjusting from a policy perspective to consider that reasonable side of things instead of intent. And what we found in this case is that after the fact, getting a little bit more involved, the resolution probably would have looked somewhat the same regardless. You know, in our estimation, after doing all of the research and all of the findings, interviews, understanding from other people who were present for the situation, getting all of the facts, we would not have defined this as a incident of sexual harassment. We might have defined it as being something that was inappropriate, that needed a correction, but based on the reasonableness test, we would have not defined it as sexual harassment. But even though we wouldn't have, resolution might look similar. We might still decide that moving forward, you know, we don't want these two people working very closely together. Either way, there was training that was going to be provided to the male respondent, just some cultural communication and intercultural communication sort of training to say like, hey, here's, just so you have context to know, here's what might be a more standard practice or way of thinking somebody, you know, all of these types of things from a Canadian cultural context, just so he was aware. You know, we actually know the person who conducted that training and said like all he wanted to do was know like, what did I do wrong and how can I make sure I don't do it again? And he was very open to the training and really wanted to understand what had happened and how he could make some adjustments. And so that training, you know, would have happened regardless. And then the last piece here is just that trauma-informed situation piece, which is recognizing these are situations we need to deal with very delicately. And these are situations where, you know, though the threshold might be lower, again, it's real to that person. And so we want to take these seriously. We want to pay a lot of attention to how we make that person feel safe following an incident, and that they feel that we have taken the appropriate steps to resolve, even if we ultimately don't confirm a finding of sexual harassment and instead go more down that path of, you know, inappropriate behavior that we want to identify and correct. So that's example number one that we want to share with you. I'm going to pass it over to Devan to share the second example.
Thanks, Jane. So our second case we have titled The Tickler. It's a little bit of a less involved situation, a little bit of a shorter example, but it is a really key one. A couple key points to point out here. So in this situation, we had a respondent who was a male employee who considered himself to sort of be the prankster in the organization, right? He sort of felt it was his responsibility to keep up the morale in the organization. And what he used to do, he would go behind people and he would sort of poke them in the ribs, right? Kind of just like touch them in the side, trying to get them to sort of jump or be startled, trying to sort of surprise them. Thought it would be funny. And eventually a couple coworkers asked him to stop. It continued. So eventually a complaint of sexual harassment was filed. Couple of things to note that we will circle back to here as well is that the situation only occurred with female coworkers. He wasn't poking any of his male coworkers in the ribs, and that ultimately the manager in this situation was aware that this was happening. So an investigation was conducted, and the complainants within the investigation ultimately, there was no other allegations of him doing any other type of inappropriate touching. Most of them acknowledged that they didn't feel that he meant anything by it, but it did make them a little bit uncomfortable, and they sort of raised the question of, well, if it's not sexual harassment, why is it only happening to females in the organization? For his part, the respondent, couldn't really acknowledge why he was only doing this with the females. But he did say that he felt sort of, responsibility as a person in the organization. And this was an organization that was in the social services industry, dealt with really tough and stressful situations. And he sort of felt it was his responsibility to boost morale and keep up the spirits in the office. And this sort of goes a little bit back to Jane's comment around intent. In this case, he didn't intend to cause harm, but we had female coworkers in the office who were uncomfortable, and ultimately, it was concerning in the situation this was only happening with the females. So ultimately, at the end of the day, it was confirmed based on the investigation to be sexual harassment. But luckily, this was a situation where the organization was able to resolve this quite positively. The respondent was open to participating in efforts to resolve this going forward. There was some one-on-one coaching that happened with the respondents to help make him a little bit maybe more aware as to what may be appropriate within the workplace. There was one individual who did not want to work with this person going forward, but luckily the organization was able to make some easy adjustments to job duties so that they didn't have to interact in their day-to-day. So that was easily resolved from that perspective. But the reason we wanted to highlight this case in particular is, while this case was resolved quite positively, this is a great example of a situation that can spiral and can have a significant impact on our organization. So, in this case, luckily they were able to resolve it positively. But let's say, for example, that ultimately one of the complainants was upset with the outcome of the investigation. Maybe they felt that the respondent should have been terminated from their position or no longer with the organization. And when that didn't happen, they decide to take that complaint further and they go right to human rights, right? And those are the types of situations that as an organization, we want to try to avoid as much as possible, because we're doing the right things internally to prevent having to sort of get to that outcome. And the biggest thing that could have prevented it, or to be honest, in this case, could have even prevented a formal complaint from happening, was leadership. As I mentioned earlier, the manager was aware in this situation this was happening, but they didn't do anything about it. Now, nobody went to the manager. None of these complainants, employees, went to the manager directly and said, hey, this is happening. Can you speak to this person? Can you resolve it for me? But outside of that, the manager still knew it was going on. It was happening enough. They had an idea, they knew, and they didn't address it or do anything about it. And ultimately, leaders have a responsibility within an organization to speak up when these types of situations are happening, to get involved, and to hopefully stop them from snowballing, right? In this situation, had the manager intervened earlier, not only could it have prevented the formal investigation that had to go through, but you're able to then resolve a situation where, without major risk to the organization, without the cost of having to do a formal investigation and bring in a third-party investigator, or without the cost of potentially having to deal with a human rights complaint going forward. And ultimately, we're able to do it in a way where we can minimize, the suffering and the emotional impacts to the complainants as well, because we're addressing this issue earlier without it having to get to a tipping point where they feel like there's nothing else for them to do but to launch a formal complaint for the organization. So that's sort of a key finding in this one. And the worst place you want to be in as an organization is to be in front of human rights these days and to hear the words, "you should have known," or "you ought to have known." Right? In this case, the human rights may have said, well, the manager should have known what was going on or ought to have known. And this can really be a bit of a death note if you're sitting in front of human rights. And what we're seeing as a trend these days with damages that are being awarded at the human rights level, and we're seeing this right now. We just had a significant case over the last year in Manitoba, is that damages are increasing at the human rights level, and not because of the context of the complaint itself, but because of an organization's lack of dealing with a situation in a timely and appropriate manner. So a situation like this, again, luckily this was resolved positively, but had it not been, this is a situation where an organization may have seen some significant damages at the human rights level because leadership was aware and didn't address the situation going forward. So certainly key learning there from that perspective as well. So moving on from the case side of things, we want to talk a little bit about what comes next, right? So we've had the complaint, we've done an investigation, we've had our finding, we've maybe had some of the resolutions, whether it be training or what come from there, but how do we get back to work? How do we get back to, our culture and environment as an organization, and what do we need to do to be able to move forward from these types of situations? And the first thing that we want to think about ultimately is consider our people and their safety, right? People come first. They are the most important asset for our organization. And, it's the right thing to do in these situations. And we need to think about safety for everybody involved in this process. It's our responsibility as an organization to create a safe environment. When an investigation happens, whether or not at the end of the day there ends up being merit to the allegations, it creates an environment of uncertainty for everybody. It puts people on edge. There's often a lot of emotion involved, and we need to consider this as well. And there's also, still underlying issues at play. Just because we've, closed an investigation, the context of what happened is still lingering and is still there as well. So, in situations particularly where a complaint was found to have merit, we need to think about the complainant. How do they feel? Do they feel safe in our current environment? Are there changes that we need to consider with regards to, maybe their reporting structure, their location of work, maybe their workspace proximity to the respondent or others involved in the situation? If we're unsure what they need from a safety perspective, we ask them, right? It's the simplest thing we can do. Ask them, what do you need to feel safe at work right now? And have those conversations with them from that perspective. So that's number one. We want to think about the safety of the complainant going forward in our workplace. We also want to think about the respondent. Did they feel like there's a target on their back? Do they feel as though if they say or do anything right now, they might get fired? It's going to depend on the situation. But in cases where, maybe they made a bad judgment call, such as our first example, that Jane talked about with the two-handed handshake. It wasn't ill-intentioned. We know it's not going to happen again. This individual really didn't mean it in that perspective. Do they feel safe with their job from that perspective? And in all cases, generally, the safety of the complainant certainly does trump the safety of the respondent, especially if a complaint has found to have merit in that situation. I see there's a question in the chat. So is there any protections in place for people like the handshaker who has now had a sexual harassment complaint formally launched against him? Is there an exoneration of sorts, or does that go on his record, even though it may not have been reasonable? That's a really, really great question. As long as the investigation is handled within the workplace, the record is, stays within the workplace environment itself. So yes, there will be some documentation on his file from that perspective. Fortunately, in this situation, the organization actually brought us in to help with resolution and do actually a secondary investigation. So we were able to provide a different perspective, like Jane said, and to actually conclude that ultimately, based on a reasonable test, it wasn't a case of sexual harassment. So in that case, you know, we were able in that perspective to sort of change that internally. But certainly, I mean, if something does escalate to a human rights situation, I mean, ultimately, you know, the results of a human rights decision are published when they get to that level. But, you know, beyond that, you know, it does stay with the organization, certainly, and an employee would have some rights to not have that information shared outside of the organization. And we want to think about others involved in the investigation as well. You know, often we may pull in witnesses to provide their testimonial as well, other leaders, ultimately who is affected by this situation and do they feel safe? And safety is important for a number of reasons. I'm sure you've all seen this before at some point. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the basis of Maslow's theory is that human beings are motivated by our unsatisfied needs. So at the bottom level, we've got our basic physical requirements, you know, your air, water, food, shelter. And once those needs have been met, then we can move up to the next level, which is safety and security. And that's sort of the area that we're focusing on today. And safety and security needs are about keeping us safe from harm. They include things like job security, having a safe environment. And if a person doesn't feel safe in an environment, they're going to seek to find safety before they attempt to meet any higher level needs, or before we as an organization, you know, see performance, productivity, et cetera. Those are going to be impacted if an employee is solely focused on their safety and finding safety within their environment, because they're looking at it from a survival standpoint. And you know, when we are looking for safety at work, we go into self-protection mode, right? We're not looking out for others. Our stress is increased. Potentially our paranoia is increased. But on the flip side, when people feel safe at work, we collaborate with each other, we cooperate, we look out for others, we feel that sense of security and belonging and trust. And ultimately, what the research has shown is when employees feel safe at work, not only does their engagement level with the company increase, their commitment level to the organization, but ultimately performance increases from that perspective too. And we do see those results from a business perspective. So it's important from an individual level to make sure people feel safe at work. It's important from a business standpoint as well. And when we don't address safety at work, there are emotional impacts of harassment. Studies have shown that, you know, feeling unsafe in the workplace can lead to things like headache, aches and pains, anxiety, depression, you know, lack of motivation, disturbed sleep, and you can imagine the impacts that these are going to have on an individual. And these impacts are even stronger for vulnerable people as well. It adds complexity to any incident as we're working through it and what comes next. Some people are going to be more prone to a situation. You know, even a situation where on the surface it may not seem inappropriate, such as, for example, the first case that Jane talked about. You know, a reasonable person may not see that two-handed handshake as inappropriate, but in that situation, we had a complainant who, you know, based on their own experiences, you know, on a personal level outside of the organization, was viewing the situation from a trauma-informed lens. And for those individuals, you know, that particular complainant did not feel safe in that moment. And that's a very valid feeling. And those emotional impacts are going to be felt in that situation. So what can we do here? Well, we can help people access resources. Right? We may have, if we've got an employee assistance plan within our organization, it's a fantastic resource. Employees can access confidential counseling that they can connect to. Perhaps your benefit plan, as part of the paramedicals, offers some compensation towards counseling as well. We might do some training or some one-on-one coaching. This might happen more with the respondent in these situations. You know, sometimes it is about building awareness for those involved. You know, not all situations are found to have merit or ill-intentioned. Some are, but for others, you know, helping to build that education and awareness is sort of an important next step. You know, to help them, feel comfortable in the workplace going forward, but also make sure that, they're not doing something unaware and ill-intentioned that may make others feel unsafe in the workplace as well. And then, those of us who are in HR, we're a resource as well. Like HR is a resource, leaders become a resource. It's not that we're there to necessarily solve everything. We can't control how an employee feels, every little moment about being in the workplace, but we can make it very clear to them, what resources are available, how they can access those resources, and what's at their disposal. Ultimately, at the end of the day, at work, we want to be seen, we want to be heard, we want to be treated with dignity and respect, we want to feel safe, we want to belong. These are all things that as organizations we need to consider, not only as we go through an investigation process, but how do we consider these as we move forward and what comes next. We want to think about them with the perspective of our policies and processes as well. Typically after an investigation, a step that we're going to take is to review our policies. Did it meet our needs? Did it hold up in the process? Are there any updates that we need to provide? Perhaps something was recommended as part of the investigation process for us to review. So we want to think about the tactical side of our policies, but we also want to think about how did people feel through the process? Did the process make them feel safe and heard? And how do our policies support that environment of safety as well? Answer is one, just at what point is it important to bring legal representation into the situation? That is a great question. And the typical HR answer is it depends. But it might depend on the severity of the situation. From our counsel with clients, I would say anything that involves a leader in the organization, if a complaint is being made against a leader, you likely want to bring in an independent third party, and it might be legal counsel, it might be an HR consultant as well that does investigation work, but you want to make sure that there's not a perception of bias from that perspective. So in those situations, because depending on the outcome of an investigation, someone's always going to be upset with the results. Either your complainant because it wasn't found to have merit, or your respondent because it was found to have merit, and now potentially there's some disciplinary action or maybe even termination of employment that's happening. And from an organization standpoint, you want to make sure that you have that impartial investigation to sort of fall back on when it's a leader within your organization, so that if the complaint isn't found to have merit and it's against a leader, you're not seen as the perception of potentially being biased in that situation. Second thing to consider would be what is the context of the complaint and what are your internal capabilities and resources to handle that, right? Potentially something like a two-handed handshake, depending on the person involved, maybe they can dig into that, within the organization and resolve that appropriately. But, depending on the level of the incident from a sexual harassment standpoint, things that we're seeing nowadays, many more complaints that are related to race relations within the workplace as well. These might be the type of things that you need to evaluate as an organization. Do we have the expertise to appropriately manage these situations going forward? And, if you're unsure, it's probably good to seek the advice of an HR consultant or legal counsel, even if it's just at the onset to get some advice on how to approach it, even if you do it yourself. But you probably do want to pull somebody in to help give you that impartial decision that then you can sort of fall back on as an organization. So it sort of depends on the situation, but sort of the more complex emotional situations, and then anything involving a leader would be the two areas I would really consider bringing in outside expertise. Great question. So first we think about the safety of our people, and obviously that does come first, but at the same time, the work doesn't stop, right? Business keeps going. Our organizations have to keep moving day to day. So we need to ensure the safety of our business as well. And a couple of things that we want to think about there is what are we doing to meet the needs of our customers and our business needs during this time? So from a people perspective, so that people can still perform the way they need to, so that we can still meet our needs as an organization, what do we need to do? Do we need to separate people? Do the complainant and respondent need to be separated? You know, sometimes that's an option, sometimes it's not. If they're in key roles in an organization or maybe part of a really small organization, it may not be possible to separate them. And so in those situations, what can you do to promote safety? And that's where the process side of things comes in. Maybe you need to have a third party in place, right? So that there's no contact for a while and they sort of go through an intermediary so they don't have to speak to each other. Maybe we just set the expectation they can only discuss business matters strictly, and maybe there's some sort of caveats around what that looks like as well. So there's certainly options from that standpoint. And then we need to think about our stakeholders as well. And that comes from a couple perspectives. We're seeing an interesting trend over the last couple of years, and I think Jane will talk about a little bit around the communication side of things, but we're seeing organizations that are starting to distance themselves from certain stakeholders who may have been involved in a situation, and being very cautious about you know, who they're sort of tying their business to. But on the flip side, from the stakeholder standpoint, the other thing that we've seen in a unique sort of situation is, what if your complaint involves a stakeholder, and how do you manage that relationship? So we had a client a few years ago who you know, had a complaint that came from a supplier. So the complainant was an employee of a supplier of theirs, a key important supplier that was a major supplier to their business, who had a complaint about one of our clients' employees. They were the respondent, and the complainant alleged, she was female, that this male respondent would come up behind her when she was sitting and sort of put his arms kind of around her stomach, and sometimes even a little bit lower than that. And she felt very uncomfortable and that it was inappropriate. And not only did, you know, our client have to manage this investigation and manage this complaint, but at the same time, you're managing that relationship with your key supplier and stakeholder to make sure that on the business side of things, we're still meeting our needs and demands, and figuring out what that looks like from an organizational standpoint, from, you know, a business continuity standpoint going forward as well. So we want to think about things from that perspective. I'm going to pass things over to Jane to talk a little bit about the culture, restoring workplace relationships and culture. I'll ask you guys to bear with me for a second. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so she can share her screen and have control over the PowerPoint for a minute.
Perfect. So I am going to share my PowerPoint slides here. Hopefully you can see those. Thumbs up if you can. Are they on? Excellent. Okay, so we are going to finish off talking a little bit about restoring relationships and this sort of paying attention to workplace culture, and even considering what does whatever has happened within our organization mean for our workplace culture. You know, what does it tell us maybe about our existing workplace culture? And so one thing I want to start with is something we share in a ton of the different types of training that we do, whether it's leadership training or talking about engagement, is recognizing that leaders, senior leaders, and organizations are responsible for the performance and the professional health of their team. You're responsible for getting stuff done, that performance side of things, but you are also responsible for professional health. You are responsible for how people feel about being at work day in, day out. And I kind of look at these two things like they need to be in balance. Like, you know, I don't want to ask so much of performance that I sacrifice people's professional health. I also maybe long-term can't just focus on professional health and sacrifice performance. I want to find a bit of a balance there over the course of a year. But how people feel about work matters. And particularly after an investigation, as Devan has said, it's important to consider, how do people feel about work? You know, are they dreading going to the workplace now? Do they have the Sunday night blues where on Sunday night they start to think, oh, I can't go back to that place on Monday morning, right? And how do we restore relationships and culture so that people can feel good about coming back to work? And part of that is communication strategy, and where it makes sense, transparency. There are going to be many situations where you're not going to be able to be fully transparent, right? Where aside from communicating findings to potentially the complainant and the respondent, you're not sharing anything else, and you're expecting them to keep that information, you know, locked down as well. But there are situations that become bigger than our organization, where we might have an opportunity, and there might be an expectation for us to comment on where we stand on something as an organization. And so, what do we have to communicate internally to our teams? Are apologies required? Do we need to even as an organization acknowledge that, hey, this shouldn't have happened and it happened on our watch and we're sorry it happened on our watch, right? Do we have to put some type of communication out there where we acknowledge maybe our part in allowing a culture to sort of fester that was going in a inappropriate direction? What communication is required to the entire team? What communication is required to those that were just involved? And then are there times where we have to communicate to the broader community at large? And the example we'll use here is Amazon. A number of years ago, Amazon had a situation where the Amazon Studios leader, Roy Price, was accused of sexual harassment. And this was a message that went out to all employees following the incident and the accusations. And this was something that, was shared widely, and they knew it would be shared widely. So when they sent this out to employees, they knew this was going to end up being a public communication, essentially a public statement, right? So they've immediately identified they don't condone this behavior. If a concern is brought to their attention, they will take it seriously. They will put it through an investigation, emphasizing that any concerns related to harassment or abuse need to be reported and the process there. They then specifically address Price and that he is on a leave of absence. They also, at that time, it was a time where there were a lot of things happening in sort of the Me Too movement. They also acknowledged that they're reviewing their projects with the Weinstein Company, recognizing that with all of the allegations that came out against Harvey Weinstein, that they were reevaluating those relationships and whether they wanted to continue to invest in those projects. This was important. It was important that they made it clear. Roy Price was one of the most senior people in the organization. He led an entire division of the organization. It was important that they were seen, and not only seen, but really were interested in doubling down on their values, what they want their work environment to be, and what is not acceptable to them. With things like this, it makes it clear to people in the organization that, hey, if they have a problem, this is maybe a safe place where they can acknowledge it, where swift action will be taken. All right. So another question we have to ask ourselves after an incident of sexual harassment, or to be honest, any sort of serious complaint, whether it's sexual harassment, bullying, discrimination, any of these things, we have to ask us, what have we learned about our current workplace culture through this? Particularly if it's something that, is a pattern where many people are engaging in whatever this behavior is, whether it's a certain type of joke or a nickname or actions that people are taking. What does this tell us about who we are? And regardless of what we say our culture is, I know we all have vision, mission statements. We have our values probably written on the wall. Every boardroom I walk into, when I used to be able to walk into people's boardrooms, every boardroom I walk into says like honesty, accountability, respect. I mean, that was on the walls of Enron too, right? These are kind of table stakes. They're foundational. Are we actually living them, or are they just up on the wall? Right? And that's probably a question we need to ask ourselves after some things have happened within our organization. Because at the end of the day, when we think about culture, your workplace culture is what leaders and what people do day in, day out. You can call your culture whatever you want, but your actual culture is how people get work done, how they communicate, how they treat each other every day. That is your workplace culture in practice. And so there's some questions we can ask ourselves that might help us reflect on whether our culture is what we want it to be, right? So what behaviors are rewarded and what behaviors are punished? If we had a situation where people were bringing up complaints for something that ultimately had merit, but those complaints weren't addressed or dealt with initially, they weren't taken seriously, the people who made the complaints were seen as being difficult or problematic or whatever, we have to ask ourselves, what behaviors are being punished and rewarded here? We were punishing people that had a legitimate concern. What does that say about where we're at? Do people feel safe and supported talking about how they feel and asking for what they need in the organization? What are these sacred cows? Sacred cows, what are those things that we think need to be a certain way in our organization, and nobody can convince us that there's another way to do it or another way to think about it, right? Who are the people in your organization are most likely to try and tip over those sacred cows and say, hey, there's another way here. And then who are the ones who are going to stand them back up and go, nope, this is the only way. Right? You know, and that can be related to, again, how we treat each other and behaviors. It can also be related to, like, you know, I think a perfect example would be working from home. There were a lot of people before this pandemic that would have been like, our teams can't work from home. Like, that's ridiculous. We all need to be in the office 5 days a week. And anytime somebody would have suggested it, they would have propped that cow back up and said, nope, that's not how we're doing it. Well, we've had a forced tipping of the cow, and now we're all like, hey, sometimes this kind of works out okay. There's a lot of teams that are pretty productive working from home, right? Maybe we've learned some new things. How prevalent are shame and blame, and how are they showing up in your team? How do we blame people? How do we shame people? Even for sort of standing up and saying something, right? We're in a time where we're all learning a lot, right? I know I want to be in a situation where if I get somebody's pronouns wrong, they can let me know and I can say, oh, sorry, thank you for correcting me, and get it right, right? Or are we shaming somebody for saying, oh, hey, actually, we don't use that particular term to refer to this group of people anymore. We use a different term. Do people feel safe to do those things? Or is there some shame in people who are, you know, making an effort to make some adjustments along the way? This last question I think is really interesting. It's what stories are legend and what do they convey? I have worked for a few organizations where when I think back on it, and I don't think at the time I thought about it at all, but when I think about some of the stories that were legend, some of the stories that people in leadership or who had been with the organization for a long time sort of touted as like these great times, you know, there were some things that were pretty problematic about those stories, right? They were from a different era. And though they might have been kind of funny and entertaining, it is reinforcing an idea of what's okay, what's condoned, what's acceptable, right? So we might sometimes evaluate some of those stories and say, yeah, that was funny 10 or 15 years ago. That story's not as funny now. If I tell it now, I have to come at it from a different angle. I have to message it in a different way to make it clear that we're not saying this would be okay now, right? So those are some questions. You know, I mentioned as well that culture is ultimately the way we do things around here, right? We can call it whatever we want, but day in, day out, the decisions we make, the actions we take, how we communicate with each other, that is our workplace culture in practice. And so a lot of that comes down to leadership's and leadership's approach, I should say, in terms of how we deal with things when they've gone wrong, when they've gone off course, and recognizing that leaders have to care about their people and have to have their backs. The example of the tickler that Devan gave, that leader knew that this guy was pinching women, right? Saw it happen, was aware of it. You need to take ownership of that type of thing, right? To be able to say, hey, like, not appropriate, right? And to catch it before it becomes a much bigger issue. And what we're recognizing here is that leaders cannot outsource caring or accountability to anybody else. They have to care about their people. They have to have their people's backs. If they see something that is problematic, they have to deal with it. We don't get to outsource caring to HR or to somebody else in the organization. We don't get to say, hey, you guys have to care about our people on our behalf. It is up to us as leaders to care about our people and have their back. I'm going to share one really simple example here that I think sort of relates to Me Too and this movement. There are going to be times and situations where somebody is made uncomfortable by something, right? Where a woman is made uncomfortable in a situation. Anybody, could be a woman, could be anybody. Could also be a person of color, right? Who's picked up on something that has happened that maybe I don't notice because I don't identify it the same way. I haven't had the same experiences, right? I think that many people would find, and I'm sure many women would agree that you have sort of like a sixth sense about like when you're in a situation where you're like, oh, this isn't good. This is a problem, right? Just based on past history. And the example I would give is years ago, my first job working in manufacturing. I was in HR, big manufacturing facility, probably 2,000 people working there at that time. And there was this one particular man on the floor, on the production floor, who he was like, for lack of better words, he was just really creepy. And I think that if I like told this story in front of a few women that I had previously worked with back then, even now 15 years later, they could probably guess the name and they would get it right. It was just somebody that like we kind of all knew, you know, if you're walking through the plant and you felt somebody looking at you, you're probably going to turn around and see that guy. Right. And so I had said something to my boss at one point, my boss, Brad, who actually still works with Devan and I now at Acuity. But I just mentioned in passing that, you know, this guy made me a little uncomfortable. And I said, you know, if he ever comes to my office or wants to talk to me, like, I'm just always going to make sure I leave my door open. I just don't really feel comfortable being in a closed door office with this guy for whatever reason. And honestly, can't even put my finger on it. Just knew something was off here. Didn't feel right. A way that we as leaders can show we care and have people's backs is to take that seriously when somebody says it. Now, this guy hadn't done anything wrong, so Brad's not getting involved and accusing him of anything like that, right? But what I did notice is, all of a sudden, anytime this guy was hanging around in the HR offices, coming into my office to talk to me, you know, mysteriously, all of a sudden, Brad had some filing he had to do right outside my office. And what it was is he took seriously that I had this sense that something was off here. He respected that. And he said, if I can make Jane feel a little bit more safe by being in closer proximity when this guy's around, just to make sure, I can do that. That costs me nothing, right? And that's a really simple example of how leadership can show caring. Is if somebody identifies something that's even just like a twinge of like, oh, something is off here, I'm not sure, to just listen and keep an eye out for it. It doesn't mean you're going to do anything with it, but to say, hey, I'm going to watch that in the future. I had somebody earlier this week who told me about how she works in a very male-dominated industry, and she's the HR person that conducts interviews. She's the director of HR. And she finds that anytime she's in an interview, it's usually her and then one of these sort of tech people in her organization, often somebody that's a senior manager. And she said, you know, every once in a while we have a candidate that comes in, and even though I'm the one, she's the one asking all the questions, the candidate never looks at her and only looks at her male counterpart, right? And making the point of, you know, after an interview, asking her counterpart, hey, did you notice that? And in some cases they say, yeah, I did. What was that with that? That was weird. And in some cases they didn't, right? But we want to have an environment that's safe enough where somebody can say like, did you notice that that guy never once looked at me and only talked to you? For an hour and a half of an interview, didn't make eye contact with me? Like, what does that say? Or what does that tell us, right? And we want to have an environment where women or people who are underrepresented within the organization, whatever that might look like, can say, hey, did you notice that? And it's not necessarily to make a big deal of it, but to say, hey, did you notice that? Let's pay attention to that going forward, right? Does that mean anything? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but let's pay attention. At the end of the day, 84% of how people feel about their workplace are directly related to the relationship that they have with their leader. And so when we're thinking about workplace culture and moving forward, we want to focus on making sure leaders have all of the support, all of the training and things needed to be able to effectively make people feel safe and to effectively handle or escalate situations, right? To say, okay, I don't know what to do here, something's off, I'm gonna go talk to HR, or we're gonna engage another expert in this. And to recognize that when we have a bit of a culture issue at work, the best way to work on us as a team is to start with me. And so if I am a senior leader, if I am a business owner, a CEO in an organization, the best way to work on us as a team is to start with me, right? How am I leading by example? How am I building relationships? What am I condoning? You know, and what am I dealing with to really set that tone? This isn't easy. Achieving employee safety and then maintaining it, particularly after an incident, is challenging. It's a constant, everyday, ongoing process that doesn't end. It's always something we have to work at. And we have to recognize that if we don't deal with something, we're condoning it. Every time we see something that is problematic, you know, we see somebody call somebody a nickname that they don't appreciate, and we know the person doesn't appreciate it, and we don't say, hey, you know, that guy doesn't like being called Bobby, like call him Bob, right? and we let those things go, we are condoning it. And those are the situations that Devan talks about, where when they're escalated and all of a sudden somebody has now left the organization and they're mad about it and they decide, oh, I'm going to file a human rights complaint. Those are the situations that get escalated. And we don't want to be in that situation where they say, you should have known, or like you did know. Not only you should have known, like you actually did know and you just didn't deal with it. In terms of how we make people feel safe, I think it's really important that we allow leaders time to lead. We let them make time to lead, to focus on their team. We don't just overload them with sort of tasks and responsibilities that relate to the actual work, but also give them time and space to be leaders and lead. We don't bog them down just with their sort of to-dos, that we allow leaders to invest in one-on-one time, build relationships with their people, that we help leaders have tough conversations. We train them on how to have tough conversations early and often before they become a bigger issue. That we ask questions when something's off, right? If somebody is behaving in a way that is becoming problematic, that, you know, leaders feel that they can check in and go, hey, I've noticed this thing, what's going on? Again, before it becomes a bigger issue. That we're asking employees what they need to be, or what they need to be safe or to feel safe. And that we're also really diligent in ensuring there's no retaliation on those involved. Right? That we're careful that regardless of whether it was found to have merit or not, that we are paying attention to how we behave following the situation as leaders from a retaliation standpoint. HR's priorities, again, making sure everybody's physically and emotionally safe. Devan referenced, you know, EAP programs and things like that, you know, referring people to those resources, ensuring that business continuity. You know, HR is going to be key in communication strategy as well. Doing a bit of a post-mortem on the investigation. How did it go? What went well? What didn't? What would we do differently next time, right? That first case example of saying, hey, we should have actually had that guy go home with pay as opposed to suspending him without pay. Do we need to take a look at our policies and processes? And are we holding leadership accountable? You know, that if they've seen something that's problematic, that they're dealing with it. Some other leadership priorities, just again, leaders have to ensure people feel safe. We're trying to find that balance of performance and professional health. What we want to do is help people just get back to work and focus in on the work, right? We want to check in, keep the lines of communication open, and focus on creating that open, safe, sort of supportive culture that people can really speak up and speak out in. So on that note, we're 4 minutes to our end time here. So we have a few minutes if people have questions. I apologize, I haven't seen, even Devan, when you had questions, I hadn't seen anything pop up in the chat. So I may not be seeing them if they have, no? Okay.
Nothing that I've seen recently, no.
So any questions that you'd like to throw out there?
Yeah, and feel free at this point if you want to just shout them out. You don't have to use the chat function at this point.
Absolutely.
That's a question. All right, well, if there aren't any questions, we won't belabor that. I just wanted to say thank you to Jane and Devan very much. That was a great presentation. I certainly learned a lot, but I think more importantly, just gave me lots to think about to take away from that. And I just really appreciate your engagement and enthusiasm in the way you present. A recording of this presentation will be on our website under the Insights tab. So if you want to use it as a resource or just really feel like somebody else needs to see it, feel free to look for it there. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. Do stay safe and healthy and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us. Thanks for joining, everybody.